This program is a paid commercial announcement from Jacob Media Partners and does not reflect the views of WPHT or its management. Today's program is pre-recorded.
Jacob Media Partners presents The Adam Malamut Show. Real people, real perspectives, real opinion. Presented by the law offices of Adam Malamut Associates. Powered by InjuredWorkers.com. And driven by Jaguar Land Rover Westchester. Now, live from the Malamut Associate Law Studios, The Adam Malamut Show. Hosted by Adam Malamut.
And a good Saturday evening, everyone, and welcome in to Talk Radio 1210 WPHT. This is the Adam Malamut Show. Real people, real perspective, real opinion. Saturdays at 5 on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT. Adam, a good Saturday, sir. How are you?
Thanks, Krause. I'm doing great. How about yourself?
All well, man. July is moving along, and we're almost ready for football season.
We're praying football season's coming up.
The only thing bigger than COVID-19, the NFL, Adam. Come on.
Well, and baseball's coming back too, apparently, right?
Very excited.
60-game season. So moving right into our show, we'll have plenty of time to talk about football and baseball down the road. I'm going to talk about the government superpowers during the pandemic. A lot of times people are being critical these days of government action during the pandemic. These are completely uncharted waters, and one of the things that we always aim to do on our show is to educate the public and let folks understand some things that they may not have previously. The superpowers that the governments, not just the federal, but the state, county, and local governments across the country are able to take advantage of during this unprecedented time are significant. And today I'm joined by my partners, Tony Drollas and Mark Natale. We're going to discuss those superpowers and help everybody in the listening audience better understand why it is that the government takes the position that they do, whether we agree or not, and what gives them that authority. So moving right along, we know that there's a lot of restrictions that have been placed on businesses, on social events, on youth sports, gatherings of different sizes. We know that it's been a moving target. We know that I think Governor Murphy is up in the 160s or 70s of executive orders that have been issued so far in New Jersey. And as taxpayers, it is very easy to be critical, especially when we're taxpayers who are business owners. I've heard from a lot of restaurant owners, bar owners. I've heard from entertainment facility operators, hair salons. If you've seen our prior shows and you're familiar with the work that our firm does, you know that we have a nationwide collective and class action against the hair cuttery for labor violations that we believe we can prove they committed during the pandemic. These restrictions that have been placed in effect are, in many cases, very critical to people's livelihoods. They're critical to people's ability to decompress, to get out and socialize with their friends. They are things that have changed the way we live our daily lives. And today we're going to talk about how they came about, the authority for those, and why they are important. So without further ado, I want to help educate our public and start what I believe is going to be a great 1-hour discussion with Tony and Mark. Let's move right into New Jersey, and I want to flip it to Tony and talk about the Emergency Health Powers Act of 2005.
Something that people probably never talk about. They haven't talked about it at all, certainly not since 2005. And these days, it's what governs our day-to-day life. And that's because the governor has invoked it. This governor has invoked it in response to a pandemic. It's really, by all accounts, it's the first time any governor has done it in New Jersey since given that power in 2005. And, we hate kings as Americans. We've always hated kings. And how many times lately people have said, who is this guy Murphy thinks he's the king. He thinks he can do whatever he wants. His powers are unlimited. He can tell us from one day to the next, do this, don't do that. And we need to stop it. We need to put a stop to this. So, the fact that we hate kings in New Jersey and as Americans, it's something that's embedded in us. It's in our DNA. It's something that has been true for a long, long time since we became Americans. And, the issue in a legal sense, from what we do as lawyers, is a struggle with the governor's constitutional powers. We exist as a society based on a constitution. The constitution is the foundation, the bedrock for how we get together as a government. We don't have a king who tells us what to do and when to do at all times, and he's accountable to no one except himself. We have three branches of government in our Constitution. We do have a governor, we have a legislature, and we have a court system. So what we've struggled with as Americans for a long time is how much power should the government and the governor in particular have in the executive branch? To study the Constitution, to understand the Constitution, to understand where we are today, they always say if you're going to be a constitutional lawyer, you have to be a little bit of a historian. There's a lot of truth to that, to understand how we got to where we are today. And New Jersey, in a lot of ways, with the way our governor functions as the head of the executive branch, is different than many, many other states, probably any other state. And it's different even compared to the way things work on the federal level. The power that the New Jersey governor has as a chief executive in some ways is greater than the power that the president has. That's not to compare presidents versus governors, but from a legal standpoint, it's true. And it's true in New Jersey. And to understand the breadth of the power that the governor has today with the Emergency Health Powers Act that this governor is using to issue executive orders without the approval of the legislature beforehand, without the approval of the courts at the same time, just on his own, issuing executive orders saying, I have the power to do this, you shall do it. I'm going to close schools, I'm going to close businesses, I'm going to require people to stay at home. All those things unchecked, at least so far, would seem remarkable, unfathomable when you go back through time. And I think just a little bit of history, if you don't mind, might help people understand the extent to which this governor has power and he's doing what he's doing.
Before we go to the history, and we'll do that in the beginning of the next segment,
Good.
You mentioned kings, and one of the things that I think is interesting is people use the term democracy but don't necessarily understand what that is. And I believe that during this time in particular, they believe that the governor is overstepping what they believe are democratic boundaries. And democratic boundaries by we're the people, we voted for this person, and he's not representing our interests. Before we go to break, real quick, Mark, you and I have been talking about Pennsylvania and some of the things that they're doing there. Does the governor of Pennsylvania have similar powers?
Well, it's interesting that Tony decided to categorize that because this fight, or at least the first round of this fight, has already happened in Pennsylvania. The General Assembly has taken the governor to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the governor. And now they're yelling king, saying that the Supreme Court granted him king-like powers. And I'll be happy to go into that in more detail in the next segment.
Sure. So we're going to take a break in a minute. When we come back, we're going to get into the historical perspective. And I think that from a constitutional law perspective, people usually go straight to the Second Amendment, especially our listeners on the Big Talker. That's a hot topic for the listening audience there, but the Constitution's so much more than the First Amendment or Second Amendment. So we'll get into that when we return from break.
The Adam Malamut Show. Real people, real perspectives, real opinion.
We're going to turn that up a notch today and say we're going to ask you if you can't socially distance, then it's going to be required. We believe the combination of social distancing, face covering, basic wash your hands with soap and water and stay away from everybody if you don't feel well and get tested. That's the combination of steps that we continue to need to take.
All right, so as we return, I want to again thank our guests, my partners, Tony Drollas and Mark Natale. We've got an exciting topic today. Our message here is always about educating the public. At the beginning of the show, I'm sure that everybody heard the disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed by our show are not necessarily that of the station. I suspect that as we continue to dig deeper into this topic, they will expressly disclaim any interest in my views and opinions. That being said, we're going to have a good time today. We're going to educate you, and we're going to talk about the history of the legislation and the constitutional provisions that gave Governor Murphy the power to issue the executive orders, which are really intended to protect the health, welfare, and safety of the residents of New Jersey. Tony?
Well, and thank you, Adam. I think, the lesson for people today, lesson for everyone today, as they sit at home, frustrated because they can't go out. They can't go here, they can't go there. If they own a business and they can't function because they're banned from being open, they're frustrated. That's not something we like to be as Americans. We like to get out and do. We see something wrong, we like to change it. If we see something we don't like, we like to speak up about it. We like to do something about it. In this case, everyone's hands are tied. Everyone's afraid. Everyone's wearing masks. Everyone's frustrated. Everyone says, we got to do something about this. How can this happen? How did this governor get all this power? He's a king. We're not about kings in this country. Well, we're not. So as a state, we have a constitution. As a federal government, we have a constitution. Before everybody's eyes roll back in their head when we're talking about constitutional law, this is it. You're living it. You have the opportunity to do something about it because of the way our Constitution is put together. But if you have a little understanding of how we got to where we are today, it might motivate you, or it might motivate you to learn a little bit more about it. So we are the United States of America. It's unusual. We're not like other countries, Germany, Norway, Italy. What is our country? Well, our country is the United States of America. That's what we are. We're a collaboration of states who got together and decided to be a country. We were states before we were a country. So our states each had their own constitutions because we all decided to be constitutional democracies, not monarchies like what we left back in bad England. We came up with a constitution in every state, and then those states got together and said, we'll create a federal constitution. So New Jersey has its own constitution as a state, like any other state does, like Pennsylvania does. We've had 3 in New Jersey. The first was in 1776. What convenient time. But when you look at what we envisioned in government in the United States, we looked at 3 branches of government. We looked at directly elected representatives who would pass laws that would reflect the policy wishes of the people. Then we created a governor whose job was to carry out those laws, to implement them, to execute them. And then we came up with a judicial branch whose job was to interpret those laws to help everybody do their job. Every branch of government had a check and a balance on the other so that no one branch had too much power. That's the issue that we're struggling with today. This governor over in the executive branch in the State House, he's got too much power. That's what people are upset about. Well, get this. In 1776, when we were just getting over this whole king thing, we decided to come up with a constitution that very severely limited the powers of the governor. We're not going to have a king in New Jersey. So compare this to the governor who's telling you today you got to wear a mask when you're outdoors at all times. The governor in 1776 could be elected by the Constitution for 1 year at a time. That was his term, 1 year at a time. He had no veto power. So if the legislature came along and said, we don't like what you did as the governor, we're vetoing your action. He didn't have we're overriding your action. He didn't have the ability to veto something that the legislature did. He was stuck with it. And probably the craziest difference between the way things are today and where they were then, the governor in 1776 was elected by the legislature, not by the people. So you had a governor who had virtually no power on his own. As the world got more complicated, and as cities grew and we had political parties, and we had an economy, and we had investments, and the world got more complicated and more populated, everybody realized the governor has to be able to do something on a daily basis to interact with people to make sure that laws get carried out. He does have to have some ability and not be micromanaged by the courts or by the legislature to make sure that things happen the way they need to happen so that we can all live. So we came up with another constitution in 1844. That was the second. And in the 1844 Constitution, the governor, when he was elected, served for a 3-year term, not 1 year. But he had to wait 3 years after his first term before he could run again. The idea is to prevent tyranny. No one person could be that powerful. And the big difference in 1844, the governor is elected now by the people, not by the legislature. So they had much more of a direct choice over who he was. And he had veto power over what the legislature did, but it could be overridden by a simple majority of the legislature. Didn't take too much, but at least there was some more checks and balance, and the governor in New Jersey had some more ability to do what he needed to do. That Constitution lasted for 103 years. 2 world wars, and a huge expansion in our society. Seems hard to believe that system of government lasted for 103 years, but it did. But by the time 1947 rolled around, our last constitution, the last time it's been changed, everybody realized that the governor really needs more power. Not to make him a tyrant, but to make sure that we function better as a society. And it's something that it was true then, and it's true today. And, you know, you can go back to Bush 43, who was a big proponent of the governor having a lot of power, the executive, in that case, the president having a lot of power to do his job. And even through the Obama years were very strong on the executive having a lot of authority and not being micromanaged, again, those words, to make sure that things can happen and the government can respond to situations quickly without having to check with the legislature every time before he can do something. So in 1947, we come along now with a governor who can serve for 4 years instead of 3, and he can run for a second term even as he's the incumbent. That's approaching tyranny in 1776, but that's what everybody realized. This governor needs a little bit more staying power.
And this is the beauty of checks and balances.
It is.
This is so when we talk about our American democracy, the checks and balances at the federal level, you have Congress, you have Senate, they're the legislative branch, you have the executive branch. A lot of times we've complained during this presidency that we couldn't get certain things done, and that's because you couldn't get all 3 of those branches to agree, where you have a Senate that is Republican controlled, a Congress that's got more Democratic control, and a president who, seemingly has his own particular agenda. It's a check and balance that, but for that, the Affordable Care Act would have been gone day one of his presidency. Other things that have happened in other presidencies would be stripped down by the immediate successor of the opposing party. So all of these things that have happened along the way from 1776 to 1844 to 1947 have been things that have created more balance. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, more balance, but a stronger executive, which everyone realized we do need in a more complicated society in order for government to function properly. And to the point you made a minute ago, if every time the governor needed to do something quickly, statewide, on an issue that really needed immediate attention, if he had to check with the legislature to get their approval to do something, rest assured very little will get done. Because he's looking back at a branch now where, God forbid, they're divided politically. That branch exists to disagree with each other. They exist to do nothing sometimes because that's more expedient for them or that's more effective for them. So if every time a governor needs to respond quickly to something on a statewide basis to affect millions of lives, like just what's happening today, everyone realized, at least at the time, the governor needs more power to do his thing so that we can all live a better life.
This show's flying by, and that's a great historical account, Tony. We're going to take a break in a minute. When we come back, I want to flip it over to Mark and talk to Mark about Pennsylvania and to give some perspective. Despite the fact that we are a national show, our local station that carries us covers Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, some of the Jersey Shore. I want to make sure that we're able to kind of lay this out in framework that folks who may be listening in other areas of the country are able to understand exactly the powers that are bestowed upon the executive, the chief executive in their state, whether it's the governor or however their legislature is made up, to govern those states. So we're going to take a break in a minute. When we come back, we're going to flip it over to Mark. We're going to talk about Pennsylvania. And in the meantime, thank everybody for tuning in. This is the Adam Malamut Show. We'll return in a minute.
And thank you for listening, everyone, to the Adam Malamut Show. You can connect with Adam on social media. On Twitter, you'll get Adam at Adam S. Malamut ESQ. And you can also follow Adam on Instagram at attorney_Adam_Malamut. The Adam Malamut Show returns in a moment.
From the Malamut Associates Law Studios, this is the Adam Malamut Show.
The politicians who are encouraging the people they were elected to lead to quit the fight are acting in a most cowardly way. This is not the time to give up. This is not the time to surrender. This is the time to rededicate ourselves to the task of beating this virus.
As we return, I want to thank our guests today, Tony Drollas and Mark Natale. We've got an exciting topic, and it's a topic that is really something that most people don't understand. We're talking about the government's superpowers during the pandemic. The government, and specifically the governors, have extreme powers that during my lifetime I don't recall them ever using or really needing to use. For most of our listening audience, and we'll exclude you, Krause, you're a couple years older, we haven't lived through World War I, World War II, or any of the pandemics. So I'm sorry.
I'm an old salty dog, brother.
I'll probably pay for that somewhere down the road.
No doubt.
But I saw you didn't have the mic quite ready to go at me. But, you know, these powers, it's important to understand them. So before we're critical of the people who are charged with maintaining the health, welfare, and safety of our state, our county, our municipalities, our country, it's important to understand where that power came from and the need. There's been litigation that's been unsuccessful from fitness center owners in New Jersey challenging the authority of the governor. We'll get into that in a few minutes. But before we do that, I want to flip it over to Mark Natale and talk to Mark about Pennsylvania. Just like New Jersey, the governor has significant power. Maybe not from the same statute and the same legislation, but something that on the Pennsylvania side enabled the governor to do what he or she would need to do to protect their citizens. You want to talk about that, Mark?
Absolutely. And it is the same fight that's really in its infancy in New Jersey has developed quicker because of the political climate in Pennsylvania. And that was an excellent setup, I think, by Tony on the history of it, because that's really the point where we are. If you go all the way back from 1776, the Articles of Confederation and the early state constitutions, what you see year in and year out is more and more power being divested from the federal and state legislatures to the executive branches. And now we're dealing in a moment where people are analyzing that. And quite frankly, if you want to take the politics to the side of it, it's very easy to simply explain that at this point, both major parties believe in a strong executive when it's convenient for them. So when President Obama wanted to do executive orders about the environment through the EPA, Republicans were up in arms about that. When President Trump wants to do an executive order about immigration through Homeland Security, Democrats are up in arms over that. The politics of it is at times a politics of convenience, but legally speaking, the pertinent question is what powers have been legally divested from the legislature to the executive? And when you see these political debates play out in the courts, that's what the courts are looking at. That's what the courts have already looked at in Pennsylvania and what we're going to see in New Jersey, perhaps, if Republicans or other interests decide to take this fight to court. What we saw in Pennsylvania was very similar. Governor Wolf used Title 35 of the Pennsylvania Code, which grants the governor's office the power to suspend laws and issue these executive orders in times of a public emergency, very similar to the act that Tony referenced in New Jersey. The governor did that. He halted it. And where you're starting to see some complaints in New Jersey about him Governor Murphy being a king or having too much power, you saw that escalate much quicker in Pennsylvania. And there's the reason why is really just the political climate there. He has an organized resistance. The General Assembly is controlled by the opposition party, and they wanted to put a stop to it. So about 5 weeks ago, they passed a resolution that stripped him of his power and required the governor to go back on all these executive orders. The governor refused, and it went up through the court system to the state Supreme Court. Now, ironically, by the time it reached the state Supreme Court, the majority of Pennsylvania had already entered what was called the green zone, which is lifted a majority of these restrictions. But it was still an important issue, especially as we're all expecting this to play out again in the fall when the virus comes back. And what the state Supreme Court did is it sided with the governor. And it said that the General Assembly essentially can't go back on something that they had already passed before. That they had passed Title 35 of the Pennsylvania Code. They had given this power and this authority to the governor. And now you can't pass a resolution simply saying, well, not in this instance, not in this case. If you want to restrict the power of the executive, they would need to go back into Title 35 and do that. And we all know the reason why that doesn't get done. Because then, again, it becomes a political issue. And it becomes a fact that both parties want the executive to have these powers when they're the party in control that has it and when they can exercise the powers in the way they want. But the courts don't look at things like that. They don't see this as Republicans against Democrats. They see this as the Assembly against the legislature. They look at it as the divide that Tony talked about between the separation of powers. And at this point, in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey, you have cases where the legislature has already divested the powers for this exact scenario, and the governors are simply acting in a way that the legislature already said that they can.
You talked about politics of convenience, and this is where, if we were doing this as a live call-in, our phone lines would be going crazy right now. And I can't guarantee that people at the station aren't going to get calls on this, but I can tell you that there's nothing that rubs me the wrong way on discussion of what the government is doing more than when they talk about this being a political, topic, a political agenda, a political myth. You have a lot of Republicans that have taken this as an opportunity to take shots at the Democratic governors in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of them are coming from positions of how their family has been harmed by the pandemic. But I assure you, and for those listening, I'm not a doctor, but I can tell you that neither Governor Wolf nor Governor Murphy invented the coronavirus. This isn't some liberal myth, as people like to talk about. I've seen tweets from conservatives that have talked about the liberal myth, the politicizing of this. This isn't the time to throw barbs across the aisle. This is a very legitimate public health crisis. This is a pandemic unlike anything that we've ever seen in our lifetime, including Krause. Not even Krause's seen this. But this is something that when we look at preserving the public safety, health, and welfare, if we don't have somebody sitting as a king, so to speak, we're relying on a bunch of people in two different chambers of the legislature to agree on how something can be handled. And for anybody who knows what it takes to get people into a room to make a decision, we know that people meet to have meetings to figure out when the next meeting is going to be. Hard decisions have to be made, and it's very easy for people to be judgmental during the moment of that decision or to play Monday morning quarterback, but the decision has to be made nonetheless. In 2005, New Jersey enacted the Emergency Health Powers Act, and this is something that we led the show with. Tony, talk about the importance of this act and why it's so important that we have somebody sitting at the top of the hierarchy that has the ability to steer the state in what he or she, as an elected official, believes is the right path.
So in 2005, the state legislature said, we've now lived through Hurricane Katrina. We're living through public health emergencies, and the governor needs more power. This was in 2005, to respond quickly to an emergency to make sure that the public gets the help that they need, that they get protection, that they get medical care, that it could be done quickly so that the governor doesn't have to go to the court or the legislature to say, can I do this, can I do that from one day to the next, when circumstances change quickly. And when things happen on an overwhelmingly fast basis that affect millions of people at the same time. So in 2005, the governor's powers were expanded, and the state commissioner of health, and at that time health and senior services, were given more power to respond to public health emergencies, to plan, to coordinate, to collaborate, all those good government words, but essentially to say, if the governor needs the power, the authority to go do something quickly on a statewide basis, he's got it.
And now he has it.
And now he has it. Not to make him a king, but to make sure that people get the help that they need. Everyone, frankly, was a little bit afraid. Everybody was shaken up after Katrina and the events of the mid-2000s. People thought, you know what? We've lived long enough. We realize in New Jersey that from a governmental standpoint, not a political standpoint, from a governmental standpoint, it makes sense for, in the first instance, the governor to have power, to have maybe a little bit more power, certainly a lot more power than he had in 1776, but power to make a decision. If we disagree with his decision, then fine, we'll have a fight about that. We like to do that in America, too. Maybe we'll go to the courts and have a fight over there, too. That's fine. But in the first instance, the governor has the power. The legislature can check him, but he can make a decision and we can act on it. Where the problems came in the past, and what the legislature was thinking in 2005 and what Congress has thought more recently, is in the first instance the governor should have the ability to do something and to act quickly to affect millions of lives, frankly, because he has the ability to do it. He has a bureaucracy. He has thousands of people on the payroll who are capable of interacting with millions of New Jerseyans, at least in this case, to get help to them quickly, to support them where it's needed. The legislature can't do that.
So I want to cut you off for a second, Tony. We got to go to break. When we come back, I want to talk about that. And I also want to talk about the fact that these powers aren't meant to give a governor the power to back up traffic from the bridge to Fort Lee. This is made for the health, safety, and welfare of the community, and people have to keep it in that context. We're going to go to break. When we come back, we're going to continue where you left off.
Real people, real perspectives, real opinion. Now back to Adam Malamut.
And back here on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT, welcome into the Adam Malamut Show. Real people, real perspectives, real opinion. Don't forget on social media, the Twitter handle is at Adam S. Malamut ESQ, or you can connect with Adam and follow him on Instagram. He's a great follow at attorney_Adam_Malamut.
Krause, you can also find us on radio.com as well as on iTunes. Also, you can visit us on our website at www.malamutlaw.com. Right before we went to break, I had interrupted Tony. I want to get back to Tony's point. You were on a roll, Tony. I'm right back with you.
Well, let's keep it going.
Yeah.
So I guess what matters most to people today, from one day to the next, because once again today the governor has come up with yet another executive order that changes things. When you give those powers to the executive, particularly in New Jersey, you still need to design it in a way so that there's some check ultimately on what authority the governor has. From 1947, for example, if the legislature did something, the governor said, no, I'm not going to do that. Now the legislature, compared to years past, 2/3 of the legislature has to come together and say, we're going to override that veto in order to make sure that what the legislature wants gets done. Here's the issue for the people of New Jersey today to think about, and to think about how they can plan of action in if they're really upset with the way things are today. Once you give the governor these powers, particularly in New Jersey, and this goes back to high school civics, right? The legislature passes a law, but it doesn't become a law until the governor approves it. Well, once you give the governor, the legislature gives the governor the power, more power to do something. Legislature wants to come along tomorrow and say, you know what? We're going to pass a law, and we're going to say the governor can't do this. Well, that law doesn't become law until the governor approves it. So that's the struggle that people have. That's where people have hindsight, and they look at the 2005 law and say, how could this have happened? How could we have given the governor so much power? We meant well, but here's what's happening. Well, look, there's still hope. If people want to change things, they still can change things. They can change the makeup of the legislature. They can change the makeup of the governor's office if they want to get things changed. It's not easy. It doesn't happen overnight. You could go to court, too, to see if the court will do something about it. But as we know, the courts are there to interpret the law, not to write the law. New Jersey courts were criticized for a long time for being legislators from the bench because they decided they knew better than everyone. And, of course, they're not accountable to anyone. They're not elected, they're appointed. So the people still have the power to respond to this, but now's the time to understand how we got to where we are, the way things are, because if you have a better understanding of the way things are now, if you're not happy with the way they are, because we are a representative democracy, because we have 3 branches of government, there's still hope for change out there if that's what people want. If people want the governor to have all the power that he has, then more power to them. But there still is a possibility to change it. It is not, in other words, a scenario where we are now back under the tyranny of a king that we so desperately tried to change in 1776.
You know, that's a great topic, and it's important for people to understand that there is a place for you to lodge your complaint, and that's at the poll on November 3rd. So if you're not happy with what the president is doing, how the president has managed this crisis, go to the polls. If you don't like the governors, go to the polls. If you don't like your locals, go to the polls. Don't sit back and be a keyboard typer, tough guy, tough woman who sits there and is critical of the process without making yourself a part of the process. Part of our country's problem is we have this great process of democracy, and I was going to save this, but Tony, you got me rolling with it. We've got this great process of democracy that we fail to avail ourselves of. People don't vote. This past week, we saw the primary election. It was a lower than normal turnout. It's a presidential year. You should be voting. And if I can't impress upon you based on what's happened this year, whether you agree or don't agree, the importance of voting to support or oppose how this year has gone, I don't know that anybody can get through. So make sure you get to the polls. My editorial's done. Mark, Let's go back to you. Let's talk a little bit about what you see in terms of how these powers have been important and will continue to be important.
Absolutely. And it is important to understand the powers going forward, like Tony said. And Pennsylvania gives a little bit of a different wrinkle to it because, unlike in New Jersey, when the Pennsylvania legislature wrote Title 35, they included an escape clause. They included a way that the legislature could get the governor to no longer have these powers by passing a resolution that ended the emergency and ended the delegation of the emergency powers. Now, it would behoove Pennsylvanians to organize if they want to use that. However, they don't quite have the power they need to do it. So what they tried to do was do a little end around that tips into the exact debate that Tony referenced that we've been having since 1776. They have enough Republicans in the Pennsylvania General Assembly to pass a resolution to curtail the powers, but they don't have enough Republicans to overturn a veto by Governor Wolf if they pass that resolution. This goes into the same debate that Tony raised that we've been having, where before governors didn't even have the ability to do a veto, that there could just be a legislative veto that governors were powerless for. Well, so what they tried to do is they tried to pass what was called a concurrent resolution, which would not require any presentation to the governor. So that way, the governor wouldn't even have a chance to veto it if possible. What the court said, no, that's not how the code is written. You need to pass a resolution that goes to the governor's desks. The governor could turn it down, and if you don't have the votes, you can't overrule it. And this goes back to our point. We've been debating for centuries now the role of executives in our local, state, and federal government. We have given them the power to respond to these situations, I think appropriately, because you cannot always wait for a legislature, particularly when you're dealing with part-time state legislators all over the country. You need an executive that can act fast. We've already given them that power. And if you have a problem with how that power is delegated, then you need to go back and to the source of that delegation and change it. You simply cannot now protest when it's someone from an opposing party using that power, or when you're upset by that governor of an opposing party's approval ratings, and when you're upset by the approval ratings of the own leader of your party, and suddenly you decide we need to cry hoax and protest. That's what people need to do if they want change.
You know, and that's a great point. So I'll probably get back on my soapbox again before we finish this show, and as we continue to talk about the government superpowers during the pandemic, I again want to thank Tony Drollas and Mark Natale for joining me today. The superpowers that we're talking about are the inordinate powers that are used during a time of crisis, and the inordinate powers that the chief executives, in this case we're talking about the governors of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, but it certainly extends to the President of the United States. I do not agree with how the President of the United States has handled this pandemic. I think that from denying that it was a real pandemic, a real virus, to impounding goods and materials and supplies that could have gone to the states, the counties, and the municipalities, put public risk at great health. The switching of the guard during this and limiting and censoring his own cabinet members, I disagree with. But again, that is not for me to determine. That is for you to determine at the polls on November 3rd. This has been a great show. I hope that you'll continue to tune in. We'll be back again next week. We're going to be talking about enough labs and female empowerment and empowering our young people to be self-supportive. So on behalf of my guests, I want to thank you. This is Adam Malamut. Thanks for tuning into the Adam Malamut Show. Have a great week.
Thanks for listening to the Adam Malamut Show, a Jacob Media production. If you're interested in learning more about the power of the radio hour, contact Joe Kraus at 267-261-3428.
This program is a paid commercial announcement and does not reflect the views of WPHT or its management. Today's program has been pre-recorded.